Dungeon Dynasty, a single-player or two-player cooperative card and board game where you create your own dungeon and attempt to defeat the adventurers who enter it to claim its treasures. So, the reverse of a traditional dungeon crawl. You build the dungeon and populate it with monsters, traps, and so on in order to defeat the exploring adventures. This video will provide an overview of the game. At the start of the game, you choose one of four classes: Veteran, Beastmaster, Necromancer, or Trapmaker, each with its own special abilities and flavor, so the game will play somewhat differently depending on the choice of class. The Veteran focuses on humanoids and the usage of weapons and armor, orcs, ogres, and so on. The Beastmaster is more oriented towards beasts and monsters, hellhounds, cave bears, and other such creatures. The Necromancer, the undead of course, skeletons and zombies, and later on perhaps a vampire or a leech. In the focus of the Trapmaker being on traps, he gets additional options for powerful traps, a decapitating guillotine trap or perhaps a crushing wall trap. So you choose one of those four classes, the overall tone of the game you wish to play. The game is played in two different modes. One mode is the campaign mode, where you build and expand your dungeon. You construct corridors and rooms, drawing on this map, designing a dungeon in the classical way. Various resources are needed: wealth and gold, metal, stone, wood are the basic resources. Then there are special resources, corpses and piles of bones for the necromancer to animate, or meat for the beasts to eat. So campaign mode is all about building and populating the dungeon. Here you draw cards to hand from the campaign deck and play them. For example, gaining resources, here metal or wood, or building a trap, in this case a pit trap. Or you can improve an existing trap, adding spikes. So each card can be used in multiple ways. In this case, to improve an existing pit trap or construct a new one. Also, if the card has the right icon, it can be used to provide a bonus to another card played. This card allows you to add poison to a trap, making the spikes at the bottom of the pit poisonous, for example. If you have the right ingredient, a poison dose in this case. Or you can populate your dungeon with goblins, either add more goblins or train an existing goblin to be an archer. So the campaign deck consists of various cards for constructing and improving your dungeon. Various cards are added to the campaign deck depending on the class chosen. Here's a Beastmaster card, level 1, so a card you have from the start. It allows for deploying an additional beast, or it provides meat for feeding your monsters. As you advance in class level, more cards are added to the campaign deck. Here's a level 3 card, which allows for the placement of a cave bear, a rather powerful beast. Again, you can opt to make an existing cave bear more powerful. For the trap maker, here for example, you can deploy more traps than normally allowed and place them closer to each other. And you get more specialized traps. Here, a powerful rolling boulder trap that crushes the unfortunate adventurer who triggers it, if not fast enough to avoid it. If you have selected the veteran class, the focus is oriented towards humanoid troops for orcs, for example. You get more equipment and weapons for your troops. Here, the necromancer has the option to get those special resources he needs, piles of bones or corpses. With this card, he can animate a skeleton. So, as you expand and improve your dungeon and defeat the adventurers who enter it, you gain class levels and thereby add more cards to the campaign deck, allowing you to add more interesting, more powerful stuff to the dungeon. At the start of the game, a random map is created with various locations and rooms, each with different features. Or a pre-made map can be used instead, useful if you play the game for the first time. Here the locations have been placed already. Iron ore, for example. Here the entrance to the dungeon, and here a natural cavern where the lizardman lives. Bottomless pit here. So there are various options. A random map or a predetermined map where you can connect your dungeon to those locations. You construct locations of your own, of course. The presence of the existing room leads to an interesting start choice. Where will I place the initial part of my dungeon? On the pre-made map, the entrance has already been placed to make things easier. But if this was a random map, where would you place the entrance? You could opt to attempt to add the lizardman to your ranks early on, or perhaps you're more interested in the silver ore over here, for example. What to prioritize? So this is an initial, interesting consideration that shapes the early game. Then you expand your dungeon. You've got goblin workers who can construct corridors and rooms. Each time a new location is built or an existing room is connected to silver ore, ancient crypt, and so on, then a card specific to that location is added to the campaign deck, in the same way as class-specific cards were added. This is a core concept of the game. If the location is a mushroom forest, the card provides additional food or allows for harvesting poisonous mushrooms. Bottomless pit. Here you can easier retrieve the corpses and equipment of unlucky adventurers who have met their death by tumbling into the depths of the pit, and so on. The game can be played as a simple game variant, perhaps the first time or two, but if playing the full game, it's possible to build various stuff that can be placed on the rooms of the dungeon. Doors, or here a sarcophagus, portcullis, pool, false door, and so on. Various stuff that you, if you have the right resources to build, can add to your dungeon. So in campaign mode, you construct your dungeon, add rooms and corridors, and place monsters and traps, attempt to steer astray the adventurers who enter the dungeon in order to reach the treasure you have placed there. Away from the treasure and instead make them trigger traps and encounter monsters as they do futile exploration of other parts of the dungeon. So a lot of possibilities for creative dungeon crafting. At first the dungeon is fairly small, but as you expand it gets bigger and more complex, and even more deadly to explore. When playing in campaign mode, at first you draw cards to hand from the campaign deck, the green cards we saw before. Then you choose which operations the workers will conduct. That is, you can construct new rooms or corridors, depending on how many workers you have available, sell resources, and so on. So a degree of resource management here. Then you can play cards from hand, and then you must pay upkeep. That's an important part of the game. The more infamous you get and the more guardians you must pay and feed, the more expensive your dungeon is to maintain. So you have to get gold, and preferably also advance in class level and infamy so you can win the game ultimately. This is done by announcing a competition. This can be done at the end of any campaign turn if you so choose. You offer a prize, place a treasure in the dungeon, and challenge adventurers to come and get it. In classical death trap dungeon style, if all goes well, they will be defeated by the traps and denizens of the dungeon, and you can loot their corpses for equipment and valuables. And if powerful adventurers are slain, you will advance in level and infamy. Often you will play a number of turns in campaign mode, playing cards, developing your dungeon, adding traps and guardians, and then, typically, if you are low on gold, or if you find the dungeon sufficiently deadly, you'll announce a competition. By doing this, you will temporarily switch to Dungeon Delve mode. You place tiles corresponding to the corridors and rooms of your dungeon. Here merely a small dungeon, just to show the concept. Here's the entrance where the adventurers enter the dungeon. Over here are a pit trap and a false door, so hopefully the adventurers will be lured to the door and fall into the trap. Down here a couple of goblins are standing ready. Pit here, so when the adventurers move down the corridor, they can be attacked here. Here a door has been placed. Here a spear trap, and here a chest with a prize or treasure the adventurers attempt to reach. And here an ogre who guards it. Here are the cards of the traps. Stats, accuracy, strength. This trap doesn't have that stat though, as the target simply falls down into the pit. Damage, doesn't suffer any damage initially, but will suffer damage from falling into the pit. The spear trap here deals direct damage. And here are the two goblins. In the simple game variant, equipment is not used, but when playing the full game, the humanoids can be equipped with various armor and weapons. This goblin fights with a round shield, leather armor, and a short sword, and the other just a spear. And here's the ogre swinging a club. And here are the false door, the pit, and the other things we've built for our dungeon, each with their particular properties and special rules. The guardians, for example, have a number of stats. The goblins' accuracy and strength are not very impressive. Neither are agility or armor or hit points or morale. The goblins are your basic low-level troops. The ogre here is much stronger. Only accuracy of 1, but strength 4, which is a very high score, making the ogre particularly well suited to pound adventurers wearing heavy armor. Agility of merely 1 and no armor, stat of 0, unless it is wearing a leather armor, for example. 5 hit points, which is also a fairly high stat, and a morale of 2. The adventurers delving into the dungeon are here. Their number and levels depend on how big a prize is offered. In this case, 2 second-level adventurers, fighter and a thief. It could also have been other classes, mage or cleric. As the level is dependent on the size of the prize, you can influence how powerful the party of delving adventures will be. The greater the prize, the more powerful the adventuring party. But also, the greater the rewards should everything go well. The equipment and gold, and sometimes ingredients for spells and other such things. So this is just a small dungeon to exemplify the dungeon delve mode. But as shown before, the dungeon can easily be much bigger and more complex, containing many more rooms and traps. During a dungeon delve, two different decks are used. In campaign mode, the campaign deck is used, but during the delves, it is instead the trap deck, concerning traps and the movement of the adventures, and the guardian deck, which concerns the actions of the monsters guarding the dungeon. The decks include a number of basic cards. Here, for example, is a card that allows for a trap to better penetrate the armor of the target, or that makes an adventurer move in a different direction than he originally intended. He becomes aware of something interesting to his right and thus moves in that direction. If played at the right time, this card might thus steer the adventurer right into a trap. Or an already triggered trap can be reset, or an adventurer making a bad move, triggering an adjacent trap, or suddenly turning left, and so on. So there are a number of basic cards. In addition, as it was the case for the campaign deck, other cards are added to the trap deck according to what you have built or placed in the dungeon. Here, for example, if the dungeon contains an open door, this card is added to the trap deck. Perhaps the adventurers don't notice the door at first, taking a different path through the dungeon, potentially leading them towards dangerous traps or ambushing guardians. Or perhaps the door is opened, allowing for beasts or other guardians to be activated and move towards the intruders, ideally surprising them from the rear. Here's a guillotine trap, which provides this card. When triggering the trap, the adventurer not only loses hit points, but this card might cause him to lose a limb, or maybe even his head. So these cards allow for enhancing the effects of the traps or other stuff in the dungeon, especially if played at the right moment. Other cards in the trap deck are added according to which adventurers that make up the party. If a wizard mage, for example, participates in the delve, then perhaps he becomes unable to maintain concentration for the spell he's casting and it fizzles. Or perhaps he finds it particularly unpleasant and demoralizing to be locked in melee. So the cards in the traps deck allow for both enhancing the effects of the traps and affecting the movement and to some degree the actions of the adventurers. Then there's the guardian deck, and like the trap deck, it contains some basic cards. Here, a card that improves a guardian's armor value against an attack, or provides a bit of luck if you're otherwise running out of it. And here, the morale of the adventurers is reduced, perhaps making them flee the dungeon. But just the right card can be drawn, matching the equipment of a guardian perfectly and enhancing his effectiveness. Or guardians further away can be activated as they notice the sound of combat. Some cards allow for interaction between traps and guardians. Here a guardian is allowed to move through a trapped square without triggering the trap. Like it is the case for the other decks, certain cards can be added to the guardian deck. If a Hydra, for example, inhabit the dungeon, a card associated with the Hydra is added, allowing him to regenerate a head or focus multiple bite attacks on a single foe. Likewise, if we have equipped this goblin with a weapon, a short sword in this case, the card matching the short sword is added to the deck. Perhaps we have even managed to attract a spellcaster to the dungeon, like this leech, leading to powerful spells being added to the deck. So the trap and guardian decks are used during dungeon delves, allowing to affect the exploration and tactical combat occurring during the delves. One's hand is limited to only 3 or 4 cards from each deck, so an important and sometimes agonizing part of the game is to decide whether to play or discard a specific card now or keep it for optimal use later on, as you foresee that just the right situation for playing the card arises in a few turns, but thereby not making room for other cards, risking unpleasant discards. An example of how meaningful decision making is a core aim of the game. So in this way, the decks are expanded according to which traps and other stuff have been constructed and which guardians have been added to the dungeon and which equipment they use. Thus, the game has an important deck building aspect. One of the great strengths of the game is its replayability. Not only did we see the different classes, each with their own unique attached cards gains as you advance in level, providing variety to the game. There are also many different traps that can be constructed. Classics, such as the pit trap or spear trap, or a crossbow bolt trap. Perhaps a snake is placed in the treasure chest, attacking when the chest is opened, or a skeleton raises from a sarcophagus. Or maybe the adventurers can be slided into a nearby pit. Flames, or a portcullis that separates the adventurers from each other, making it easier to deal with them. Monsters hidden in a pit, the guillotine trap from earlier. And here are some of the larger traps, an entire corridor that drops, the boulder that rolls over unlucky adventurers causing much damage, and the lethal crushing wall that simply crushes to death everyone in the room. And likewise, there's a lot of miscellaneous stuff that can be built and placed in the rooms of the dungeon. Doorways to steer the adventurers in a certain direction, various doors, even massive bronze double doors, a lock for a door preventing the adventurers from opening it, portcullises, or other types of contraptions that hinder the path of retreat and lead them to trigger traps. Pits can be dug, a sarcophagus hiding an undead, or perhaps you have hidden the treasure here. And more specialized stuff, a pool containing poisoned water for the adventurers to drink, or perhaps it contains healing water for your own guardians. And of course a chest storing the treasure. And likewise a lot of different guardians and an entire deck of attached cards that are added to a guardian deck as the guardians are placed in the dungeon. Humanoids, goblins and orcs, lizardman, minotaur, hill giant, and so on. And the undead, from the iconic animated skeletons and zombies, require piles of bones and corpses, such as the corpses of slain adventurers, to ghoul, white mummy, vampire, spectre, up to the lich, the powerful spellcaster. And the beasts, again, the iconic ones, giant rats, hellhounds, and the more unusual monsters, gelatinous cube, carrion crawler, displacer beast, chimera, and finally the mighty dragon. So a wide range of different guardians. Depending on which class you choose at the start of the game, different types of guardians will be more or less common in the dungeon. As mentioned earlier, the veteran specializes in humanoids, the necromancer and the undead, of course, and the beastmaster in, well, beasts. As already shown, the guardians are represented by standees during the tactical combat and movement of the dungeon delves. Lots of different weapons and armor, again each with its own attached card, from melee and ranged weapons to various shields and armors, and magic items, looted from the corpses of the most powerful adventurers. Many different adventurers who delve into the dungeon, varieties of the classical archetypes, mage, fighter, thief and cleric. Paladin, for example. Barbarian. From the inexperienced apprentice to the powerful archmage. And like the guardians, they are a standee for each adventurer for use during the dungeon delves. And locations as well, a number of different locations to include in the dungeon. So there are several different types of cards and associated decks. A deck mat is used to organize the decks. Here's the mat for the simple game variant. And with the decks, workers, classes, and the many attached cards of each deck, locations, adventures, traps, and guardians. And here the deck mats for the full game. Several other types of cards have been added. So here we have all the different types of cards. Some for constructing and developing your dungeon, and some for the tactical combat of the delves, and the associated cards for campaign deck, guardian deck, and trap deck as appropriate. Dungeon Dynasty is a somewhat complex game. Once one gets a grip of it, it runs fairly smoothly though. Player aids showing the turn sequence are a big help, for example. The rulebook is about 30 pages. Playing time is a couple of hours for the simple game variant, perhaps 4 to 8 hours or more for the full game, and even longer for the extended game, a variant for those who wish to dig deeper into the endgame content. Fortunately, it's very easy to save the game, that is, to pack it away and continue playing at a later time. Each game of Dungeon Dynasty can be played as a standalone game. You may also wish to play a series of individual but connected games though, building an entire dynasty, a Dungeon Dynasty. Then some magic items gained can be kept from game to game, and some of the adventures slain are gone permanently. They don't return in future games of that dynasty. During combat, the adventurers get a bonus to attack and defend according to a roll of this dice, ranging from +0 to +2. When playing Dynasty games, a different die is used. Initially, it has the same values on its sides as the normal die, but as you win or lose Dynasty games, you replace existing stickers on the die with new ones, changing the range of bonuses the adventurers get. The goddess of luck favors the victorious. So, if you want your individual games to be part of a greater story or context, the Dynasty option allows for this. In conclusion, Dungeon Dynasty is a fairly extensive game, combining dungeon building with tactical combat, campaign mode, and dungeon delve mode. It allows for in-depth development of the dungeon in combination with the tactical aspects of the delves. The feel or atmosphere of the game is kept in line with classical fantasy and tropes. The game is not aiming at building an all-new world or setting, distancing itself from the classical tropes, but instead at the feel of dungeon craft, tactical combat, and the meaningful choices within a well-tried framework. The meaningful choices are a core aspect of the game, as are the creative decisions of the dungeon crafting, and not least, the cooperative aspects. The game can be played as a single-player game or as a two-player cooperative game, with shared decisions on the overall design of the dungeon and one player taking care of the traps and the other the guardians doing the delves. All in all, if you like constructing a dungeon, tactical combat, cards and deck building, some degree of complexity and considerable length, classical fantasy and solitaire or cooperative gameplay, you might want to try out Dungeon Dynasty.